Imagine trusting someone with your money only to find out they've been stealing from you for years, small sums at first, but eventually leading to a massive fortune. In 2009, a group of KFC employees ran a scam so large it stole millions from the company, and it all went unnoticed until an unexpected audit uncovered the truth. How did this fraud grow so large, and how did the FBI finally bring it all crashing down? This is the true story of greed, deception, and the downfall of the KFC fraud scheme. KFC, or Kentucky Fried Chicken, is a globally recognized brand known for its signature fried chicken and secret blend of 11 herbs and spices. With thousands of restaurants worldwide, KFC built its reputation on quality, trust, and great food. Customers trusted the brand for its consistency and commitment to excellence. However, in 2009, that trust was shattered by a massive scam that had been quietly draining millions from the company for years. This wasn't just a small mistake. It was a well-organized and coordinated scheme that took advantage of KFC's trust in its own employees. As this scam unfolded, it would shake not only KFC, but the entire fast food industry, highlighting how even the most trusted brands can fall victim to greed and deceit. How did a few trusted employees pull off such an elaborate fraud? And why did it take so long to uncover? This is the true story of how a massive internal fraud nearly brought one of the world's biggest fast food chains to its knees. KFC, or Kentucky Fried Chicken, entered the UK market in 1965, and over the years, it quickly became one of the most recognized fast food brands. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, KFC had firmly established itself as a fast food icon in the UK. With its signature blend of crispy, flavorful fried chicken and a family-friendly atmosphere, KFC became a favorite among people of all ages. KFC's ability to cater to the needs of different customer segments was a key factor in its success. Families appreciated the meal deals that allowed them to feed a group with a variety of options, while individuals found comfort in the convenience and consistency of a quick meal. The chain offered a menu that appealed to a broad audience. Whether people were craving a hearty meal with sides or just a quick snack, KFC had something for everyone. One of KFC's biggest selling points in the UK market was its consistency. Regardless of where customers went, whether it was in London, Manchester, or a small town, people knew what to expect: a hot, freshly prepared meal that tasted just like the one they had last time. KFC built its reputation on this trust in quality, ensuring that every customer had the same positive experience, no matter which restaurant they visited. The familiar taste and the appeal of the secret recipe made KFC a household name, and as the brand grew, so did its influence in the competitive fast food market. In the UK, KFC became known not only for its food, but for its customer service as well. Part of that success stemmed from the company's focus on employee loyalty and consistency. Many of KFC's employees worked for the company for years, often starting at entry-level positions and working their way up. This commitment to promoting from within helped foster a strong sense of loyalty and pride among staff members. As employees grew within the company, they gained greater responsibilities, and some were eventually trusted with managing significant aspects of the business, especially the financial side. KFC's employee system was built around the idea of giving trusted, long-term workers more authority. Staff members who demonstrated responsibility and dedication were often promoted to managerial positions, where they could oversee the daily operations of each restaurant, including financial management. These employees were given significant control over cash handling, refunds, and food orders. This trust was foundational to the company's internal structure. KFC relied on its employees to maintain the integrity of the business and ensure smooth operations across its hundreds of locations in the UK. For many employees, working at KFC wasn't just a job, it was a career. This stability and the opportunity for advancement made KFC a preferred employer in the fast food industry. Employees took pride in their roles, knowing that their hard work could lead to long-term growth within the company. However, this trust in employees would later become a key vulnerability, especially for the company's financial system. At the heart of KFC's operational model was its employee system, which allowed for a great deal of autonomy at the restaurant level. Each restaurant had a manager who was responsible for overseeing day-to-day operations, managing staff, and ensuring customer satisfaction. But the role of these managers extended beyond simply running the restaurant. They were also in charge of the financial side of things. Managers handled cash, processed refunds, and ensured that financial records were accurate and up to date. As part of the company's policy of promoting from within, employees who demonstrated trustworthiness were given even greater responsibilities, including the management of money. This was especially true for senior managers and regional managers who were tasked with overseeing several locations. These employees had control over significant sums of money and were relied upon to maintain the integrity of the restaurant's financial transactions. KFC's system was built on the assumption that its managers were honest and would manage the business's finances with the same dedication and care as the rest of the operations. But this level of responsibility also created opportunities for exploitation, opportunities that a small group of KFC employees would later take advantage of in the 2009 fraud. For years, KFC's success in the UK had been rooted in one key factor: employee trust. The company placed its faith in its employees, especially those in managerial positions, and believed that they would act in the company's best interest. After all, many of these employees had been with the company for years, often starting in entry-level positions before working their way up to higher roles. KFC's culture was built on loyalty, and many employees had been promoted into positions of responsibility because of their hard work and commitment. This trust extended into the financial operations of each restaurant. Managers and other trusted employees were responsible for handling cash, issuing refunds, and processing financial transactions. They were also in charge of overseeing the food orders and making sure everything ran smoothly. The company relied on these employees to manage the daily flow of money and ensure that everything was accounted for properly. However, this trust also came with its risks. KFC had placed so much faith in its employees that it never fully questioned the financial system they operated within. As long as the daily operations were running smoothly and there were no customer complaints, the company assumed that everything else was being handled correctly. But behind the scenes, a small group of dishonest employees saw this trust as an opportunity for personal gain. With access to financial resources and no immediate oversight, they were able to exploit the system for years before anyone noticed. This would lead to one of the biggest frauds in the company's history, a fraud that would remain hidden until an unexpected audit finally exposed the truth. KFC's reliance on employee trust, while beneficial in many ways, ultimately left the company vulnerable. What began as a model of loyalty and opportunity would become a perfect storm for exploitation. This vulnerability would be exploited in the 2009 fraud case as trusted employees took advantage of the system, undermining the company's financial integrity and leaving a trail of deceit that would only be uncovered after years of manipulation. In large organizations, there are always individuals who blend in seamlessly, people who may seem unremarkable, but hold the power to cause significant damage when their personal motivations shift. The KFC fraud case in 2009 was no different. The key players in this scheme weren't hardened criminals, but long-standing employees, store managers, regional supervisors, and financial officers who had been entrusted with KFC's internal operations and finances. These were people who knew the company's systems inside and out, and their ability to manipulate these systems for personal gain would eventually lead to a scheme that drained millions of pounds from the company. The individuals involved had direct access to KFC's financial transactions, and the most influential of them were the store managers. These managers had significant power in their restaurants, overseeing the day-to-day operations, ensuring customer satisfaction, managing staff, and most importantly, handling financial matters like cash handling, refunds, and sales reporting. As trusted members of KFC, they were granted autonomy to manage these aspects of the business without much oversight from higher management. This autonomy would prove to be the perfect opportunity for fraud. While the position of store managers seemed straightforward, the reality was that their control over finances allowed them to carry out small thefts that went unnoticed for a long time. These individuals were loyal employees, often with years of experience at KFC, having climbed the ranks from entry-level positions to managerial roles. However, beneath this exterior of loyalty and hard work, they were facing personal financial pressures or desires that led them to compromise the trust placed in them. At first, the thefts were small. Minor amounts were taken almost imperceptibly, such as a few coins here, a small note there. To these employees, this seemed like an insignificant adjustment in the records. The initial thefts were rationalized as harmless. After all, it was just a small error in the system, something that wouldn't cause harm to the company in the grand scheme of things. They convinced themselves that KFC, being a large corporation, would never miss a small amount of money. This is where the fraud began, subtly and almost invisibly. Employees found loopholes within KFC's systems, particularly in the way the company tracked cash flow and returns. The systems were designed to handle regular transactions and complaints, but they were not designed to account for dishonest practices, and thus they became vulnerable to exploitation. The first instances of theft were focused on low-risk areas, minor refunds, and small amounts of cash from the till. When a customer asked for a refund, a store manager might alter the records to pocket the difference between what the company refunded and the actual amount. These were simple acts, small enough to be hidden in the records, unnoticed by anyone but the thief. These small-scale thefts were rationalized as no big deal, an insignificant act that wouldn't hurt the business. Over time, however, these minor thefts gave the employees a taste of power over the system. The initial small thefts grew into more frequent and larger thefts as the employees became emboldened. What once started as minor adjustments to the books became more calculated and deliberate actions. The fraud started evolving from simple manipulation of the refund system to more complex tactics. Employees began to manipulate discount codes, offer fake promotions, and inflate sales data to pocket more money. For example, a store manager might use a discount code that was intended for promotional purposes and apply it to an order that wasn't part of the promotion, thus pocketing the difference. Other employees began inflating sales figures by altering the records to show higher revenues than what was actually earned, allowing them to take a larger share of the profits. In some cases, employees even falsely reported returns as legitimate transactions, effectively removing money from KFC's accounts without raising suspicion. What began as small thefts soon grew into a fully organized operation. Employees who had once seen their actions as harmless started to rationalize their behavior, justifying the theft by telling themselves that KFC was a large corporation and that it could afford the loss. They convinced themselves that their actions weren't hurting anyone. But as the fraud continued, it became more complex and harder to ignore. The fraud had moved from a few small adjustments in the records to a full-blown operation involving the manipulation of numerous aspects of the financial system. It wasn't just about taking a few pounds here and there anymore. The once small thefts had snowballed into large-scale fraud, with employees deliberately falsifying records, manipulating sales data, and taking large sums of money. These employees didn't start off as criminals. They were just ordinary workers who, over time, became increasingly comfortable with their actions. Each time they got away with it, they became more confident, and the temptation to steal larger amounts became harder to resist. The more they took, the more they rationalized their behavior. Their sense of invincibility grew as they saw no immediate consequences. As the scheme grew, the risks became greater. The employees involved were fully aware that they were playing a dangerous game, but the rewards were too tempting to stop. The fraud, which started with small, almost invisible thefts, gradually escalated into a large-scale, well-coordinated operation. With each successful manipulation of the system, the temptation to continue became irresistible. By the time the fraud was discovered, it had spiraled into a massive scheme, one that had been going on for years and had drained millions from KFC. What started as minor thefts had snowballed into a large-scale operation involving a network of employees manipulating the system for personal gain. The fraud had gone undetected for so long, and it wasn't until an unexpected audit that the truth finally came to light. What began as small, nearly imperceptible thefts in just a few KFC stores across the UK quickly escalated into a massive, well-organized fraud operation that spread across multiple locations. Initially, the perpetrators were just a handful of employees, store managers, and regional supervisors who had exploited minor weaknesses in KFC's financial systems for personal gain. But as the fraud went undetected and they grew more confident, the scheme expanded. The employees involved began recruiting family members, friends, and even acquaintances from outside the company, broadening the scale of their fraudulent activities. At the outset, the stolen amounts were modest, small adjustments to refund amounts, pocketing change, or altering cash flow records. However, the success of these early thefts emboldened the employees. They started bringing others into the scam, and the range of fraud grew. Friends or family members were brought in to pose as customers for fake returns, allowing the employees to pocket the refund money. Some were bribed to take advantage of the employees' position of power, receiving discounted meals in exchange for their cooperation. What started as minor dishonest actions soon snowballed into an elaborate, organized scheme. The employees discovered multiple vulnerabilities in KFC's systems, ways to falsify sales data, manipulate discounts, and create fake returns, and shared this knowledge with others, which led to the fraud expanding rapidly. Fake returns became one of the most effective methods used by employees to steal money. The process was relatively simple. Employees would purchase food from their own store using KFC's funds and then later return the items using altered or fake receipts. They would pocket the refund amount, which often went unnoticed because the company did not have the resources to track every single return in detail. As the scheme progressed, employees perfected this process. They began purchasing large quantities of food in bulk and then creating fake receipts to match the purchases. They knew that KFC's system wasn't flawless and that auditing all returns would be a lengthy, difficult process, so they took advantage of this oversight. This allowed them to pocket hundreds, sometimes thousands of pounds without being detected. Discounts for bribes was the next method that expanded the fraud further. Employees started offering significant discounts or free meals to friends, family members, and acquaintances, often in exchange for small kickbacks such as cash, gifts, or other favors. These discounts were often presented as special promotions or customer appreciation deals, which disguised the theft as legitimate transactions. The employees involved used these discounted meals as a way to increase their own sales figures, manipulating internal metrics while also pocketing money from the bribes. This tactic not only allowed the employees to pocket extra cash, but it also created the illusion of higher sales for the company. By reporting inflated sales, they made it harder to track the true scale of the fraud. The discounted meals masked what were actually thefts, making the fraud appear as part of KFC's legitimate business. As the scheme grew, employees began to manipulate the sales data itself. They found ways to alter the sales records to create the illusion of legitimate transactions, even though the money was being stolen. This became a much more complex and sophisticated form of fraud. Instead of just manipulating returns or offering discounts, they started falsifying the core data of KFC's financial records. They would adjust the sales figures, making it appear as though they had sold more food than they actually had, thus pocketing the difference. Some of the more advanced fraudsters began creating fake transactions altogether, or they would falsify transaction records, hiding the stolen funds under legitimate-looking transactions. This more complex manipulation of the system made it increasingly difficult to detect the fraud, as the records appeared clean and balanced despite the theft. As the fraud grew, so did the amounts being stolen. What began as small, isolated thefts at a few stores turned into a widespread, highly organized operation involving numerous locations and people. Each layer of fraud was designed to conceal the previous one, creating a complex web of deception that was difficult to untangle. The employees involved became more brazen and confident, believing that their actions were undetectable and that they could continue to steal without consequences. Initially, many of the employees involved in the scheme felt a sense of excitement and thrill from getting away with these small thefts. They rationalized the thefts in their minds, telling themselves that they were just minor acts, victimless crimes that wouldn't hurt anyone. But as the fraud grew, so did the risks. The employees had to work harder and more creatively to cover their tracks, and the constant fear of being caught began to take its toll on them emotionally. At first, the thrill of getting away with the thefts drove the employees to steal more. But as the amounts grew, so did the paranoia. The sense of invincibility began to fade, replaced by a constant fear of detection. The employees became addicted to the money, and the excitement of the thefts quickly turned into a dark obsession. They justified their actions by telling themselves that KFC was a large corporation that could afford the loss. But as the thefts mounted, the emotional cost became undeniable. Some of the employees even began to distance themselves from their original motives. What had begun as a few small acts of theft now felt like an enterprise, with money flowing freely into their pockets. The bonds between the employees grew stronger as they worked together to cover their tracks, but so did the risks. As the scheme expanded, it became more and more difficult to keep the deception hidden. The fraud had spiraled out of control, and it was only a matter of time before it was discovered. It was the sharp eyes of KFC's internal audit team that first noticed small anomalies, discrepancies in the daily cash flow reports, returns that didn't match up with actual sales, or slight fluctuations in numbers that didn't make sense. These irregularities stood out to the auditors, who were trained to spot even the smallest inconsistency. The auditors were thorough in reviewing financial data to ensure the integrity of KFC's operations, but the fraud they uncovered was insidious. Small enough to go unnoticed by daily managers, yet large enough to drain the company of millions. As they conducted their routine checks, the auditors quickly realized something was off. Returns had been processed with receipts that didn't match, or, more concerningly, were fabricated. Cash flow numbers didn't align with actual sales. Some stores had an unusually high number of refunds, often for items that had never been returned. Discounts were also inconsistent, with some stores offering far larger reductions than was typical. It wasn't just one or two stores. Multiple locations showed signs of unusual activity. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was something systemic. However, the company system had failed to flag the problem earlier. The fraud was well hidden beneath layers of paperwork, unnoticed because it was so cleverly disguised in daily operations. Small adjustments, subtle manipulations, and a culture of trust allowed the fraud to go unchecked. As the auditors dug deeper, they noticed patterns that suggested a coordinated effort. The discrepancies weren't random. They seemed deliberate, pointing to employees with access to financial systems being directly involved in these manipulations. The tension in the audit team grew as they pieced together the evidence, and it became clear that this wasn't a simple mistake. This was a large-scale fraud scheme. Once the auditors gathered enough evidence, an official investigation was launched. KFC's corporate management quickly realized this wasn't just a case of isolated mistakes. It was an orchestrated fraud operation. Leadership was horrified to discover that multiple individuals had been involved in manipulating records, falsifying returns, and stealing money from the company. The investigation's first step was to question the employees most closely associated with the discrepancies. Store managers who had handled cash and processed refunds were brought in for questioning. For many of them, the emotional impact was immediate. They had become used to their roles and were confident their small adjustments would never be noticed. But as the investigation unfolded, they began to understand how serious the situation was. Fear, guilt, and anxiety started to settle in. Some employees who had gotten away with their schemes for so long thought they were untouchable, but now their every action was under scrutiny. In tense interviews, investigators asked pointed questions about discrepancies in sales, returns, and discounts. Initially, many of the employees tried to defend themselves, claiming these were honest mistakes or that they hadn't realized the full scope of the issue. But as the pressure mounted, their stories fell apart. Some showed signs of guilt, nervous faces betraying the calmness they had tried to maintain. One longtime store manager broke down in tears when confronted with evidence. He admitted to manipulating the system, justifying his actions by saying he was under pressure to meet sales goals and never expected it would escalate to this point. As the investigation advanced, the fraud scheme unraveled further. What had started as small-scale thefts now seemed to involve multiple people across different levels of the organization. Each new revelation made the situation more serious, and KFC began to realize just how deeply the fraud ran. The investigation revealed that the scheme wasn't just limited to a few rogue employees. It had grown into a well-organized network of fraudsters, many of whom had been working together for months, if not longer. The employees directly involved in the thefts began to crack under the pressure, revealing more details about how the fraud had been carried out. A key figure in the scheme was a regional supervisor overseeing the stores where fraud was most prevalent. This individual had allowed store managers to manipulate returns and sales data in exchange for a share of the profits. When confronted, the regional supervisor initially denied involvement, but eventually admitted to their role. The emotional fallout from the investigation was immense. Some employees tried to justify their actions by claiming the company culture pushed them toward dishonesty. Others seemed genuinely remorseful, realizing the damage they had caused. As the investigation progressed, the scope of the fraud became clearer. The FBI was brought in, adding weight to the case. Authorities began interviewing employees and tracking down financial records, piecing together the full extent of the scam. For many of the employees involved, the realization that law enforcement was now part of the equation made the situation feel even more real. Eventually, some of the employees involved were arrested and faced charges of theft, fraud, and conspiracy. The emotional toll of these arrests was felt throughout the company. Long-standing employees, once trusted members of the team, were now facing criminal charges and the possibility of jail time. As the investigation concluded, KFC realized the fraud had been far more widespread than they had initially thought. Millions had been lost, and it would take years for the financial impact to be fully felt. For the employees involved, the consequences were only beginning. Some would spend years in prison, while others would face ruined careers and public disgrace. What had begun as small-scale thefts had turned into one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in KFC's history. The investigation had uncovered the full scale of the fraud and the emotional toll on everyone involved, both the perpetrators and the victims, was impossible to ignore. After KFC's internal audit team discovered the financial discrepancies, it quickly became clear that the fraud was far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. The company, now facing a massive crisis, called in law enforcement to investigate the scale of the operation. The FBI was tasked with uncovering the full extent of the fraud, and their investigation began to peel back layers of deception, reaching across multiple restaurant locations and involving dozens of employees. As federal investigators began looking into the financial records, they uncovered a vast network of fraudulent activities. The fraud wasn't confined to just one store, it was a national operation, with conspirators in multiple locations working together. The link between the restaurant managers, regional supervisors, and other employees began to emerge. These individuals had not only manipulated financial systems, but they had also coordinated with outsiders, friends, family, and even former employees who had been brought in to help cover up the scheme. The emotional toll on the employees involved in the fraud became evident as the investigation gained momentum. Some of them were genuinely shocked when the investigation turned to them, unable to fathom that their actions had spiraled so far out of control. Others, however, were not surprised. They had been immersed in the fraud for so long that it had become second nature. For many, the fear of being caught became overwhelming as they realized the gravity of the situation. The moment of truth arrived when the FBI began making arrests. A wave of shock and disbelief swept through KFC, not just among the employees involved, but across the company. These were trusted individuals, store managers and supervisors, many of whom had worked with KFC for years and had been promoted based on their loyalty and hard work. The betrayal was felt deeply, and it sent shockwaves throughout the KFC community. The public arrests of key players in the fraud scandal were a media frenzy. News outlets and social media platforms were flooded with coverage of the scandal. The faces of trusted KFC employees, now arrested and charged with fraud, were splashed across newspapers and television screens. The scale of the operation became clear as authorities detailed the extensive network of fraudsters, including both employees and their accomplices. The legal process that followed was long and complicated. The authorities worked to gather enough evidence to charge the individuals involved with serious financial crimes. As the details of the operation were revealed in court, it became evident just how deep the fraud ran. Many of the employees involved initially tried to distance themselves from the scheme, denying their involvement or claiming ignorance. Some attempted to cover their tracks, offering excuses or trying to shift blame onto others. The arrests were just the beginning of a legal battle that would result in convictions, heavy fines, and prison sentences for several of the key players. The exposure of the full scope of the fraud was a blow to KFC, but it also served as a warning to other corporations about the vulnerability of even the most trusted employees. As news of the scandal spread, customers who had trusted the KFC brand for years were shocked and disillusioned. For many, the KFC fraud scandal was a betrayal on a deeply personal level. They had come to rely on KFC for consistent, affordable meals, and the news that employees had been stealing from the company on such a large scale was a bitter pill to swallow. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Customers expressed their anger and disappointment on social media, sharing their shock at the scale of the fraud and their disbelief that the company's own employees could engage in such deceptive practices. Many felt that the trust they had placed in KFC had been violated, and some even vowed to never return to the chain again. The scandal also had an impact on KFC's reputation as a company that valued its employees and trusted them with significant responsibilities. The fraud scheme, which had been built on trust and manipulation, shattered the image of KFC as a reliable, honest brand. The company was forced to implement stricter financial controls, launch internal investigations at other locations, and revamp its employee training and oversight programs. While KFC took immediate steps to rebuild its reputation, the public's perception of the brand would never be the same. The company, which had once been synonymous with quality and trust, now had to contend with the aftermath of a scandal that exposed the vulnerabilities in its own operations. The public reaction to the fraud scandal also raised awareness of the importance of corporate oversight and the need for companies to stay vigilant against internal theft. In the end, the KFC fraud scandal was a sobering reminder that no company, no matter how trusted, was immune to the dangers of employee misconduct. For the employees involved, the consequences were severe, but for KFC, the damage to its brand would take years to recover from. The story of the KFC fraud case was one of greed, betrayal, and the harsh reality that even the most loyal employees can be driven to deceit when the temptation is too great to resist. The legal fallout from the KFC fraud scandal was significant for everyone involved. The perpetrators faced a variety of legal consequences, ranging from prison sentences to hefty fines. Some individuals, especially those with a more minor role in the fraud, received lighter sentences. However, the key players who masterminded and orchestrated the largest portions of the fraud faced harsher penalties. The court proceedings were long and complex, but they ultimately ensured that those responsible for the fraud were held accountable for their actions. The psychological toll on the individuals was also profound. Many of the perpetrators expressed feelings of guilt and regret, realizing the damage they had caused to the company, their careers, and their reputations. For some, the fraud had seemed like a minor infraction that spiraled out of control, but the reality was that they had betrayed the trust placed in them by their employer and their colleagues. The emotional consequences were immense, as many employees lost their livelihoods and faced the shame of their actions. In the wake of the scandal, KFC took swift and decisive steps to implement corporate reforms. The company introduced more rigorous internal controls, including more detailed and frequent audits, to ensure that such a fraud would never happen again. They overhauled their financial management systems, strengthened staff training on ethical practices, and brought in external auditors to maintain a higher level of scrutiny. KFC also worked to rebuild customer trust, offering public apologies, providing assurances that such a scandal would not be repeated, and actively engaging in brand rehabilitation efforts. The KFC fraud case highlighted the vulnerabilities that exist in companies that rely on employee trust, especially in large organizations. The fraud exposed gaps in KFC's internal processes and made it clear that robust safeguards against fraud were needed. This case served as a cautionary tale for other companies, showing that no system is immune to exploitation. The lesson was clear. Businesses must continually assess and improve their internal controls to protect both their assets and their reputation. For KFC's loyal customers, the emotional consequences were also significant. Many felt betrayed as they had placed their trust in a brand that they believed in for years. They had unknowingly been victims of a scheme that exploited their patronage. Rebuilding this trust was a long and arduous process, but KFC worked tirelessly to regain customer loyalty. The KFC fraud case was not just about stolen money, it was about broken trust. It showed how greed can cloud judgment and lead even the most trusted individuals to betray their employers. For KFC, it was a painful lesson in the importance of vigilance. For the employees involved, it was the downfall of careers and lives. But perhaps the greatest lesson from this scandal is that behind every fraud, there is a story of greed, deceit, and the eventual price paid for dishonesty. This case wasn't just a scandal, it was a wake-up call for the entire fast food industry, reminding us all that even the most trusted systems can be compromised. KFC fraud case be the last of its kind? Only time will tell.